June 14th, 2025. The 2025 Spring Goldin 100 auction was coming to a close. Auction House Goldin had curated a set of some of the rarest and most desirable sports and pop culture related items with the hopes of attracting a fervent base of deep-pocketed bidders. And the results were impressive. A 1988 Bob Ross signed painting sold for $105,000. Derek Jeter's Game 4 walk-off home run baseball from the 2001 World Series reached $158,000 with 4 bids. A Tom Brady signed rookie card from 2000 graded at a Gem Mint 10 hammered at $208,000. A 1939 Superman 1 comic graded at a 3.0 pulled in $274,500. And matching that price was a newer relic, WNBA star Caitlin Clark's black finite prism rookie card, a true one of one. A full set of 1986-1987 Fleer basketball cards sold for $341,000. The set featured rookie cards of NBA All-Stars Patrick Ewing, Charles Barkley, and Michael Jordan, and each card was graded a Gem Mint 10. A trio of Japanese promo Pokemon cards from the 1997-98 second tournament and bearing the trophy Pikachu ended at $463,000. A 2024 signed Steph Curry Olympics basketball card sold for $518,000. A 1955 Roberto Clemente rookie, $732,000. And the highest selling item in the lot was the 2009-2010 Upper Deck Exquisite Collection card featuring autographed logo patches by LeBron James and Kobe Bryant. It ended at $1,161,000. Among those treasures was an iconic action figure from the Star Wars universe. Lot number 7 featured the legendary Rocket-Firing Boba Fett prototype, hand-painted and in an early color scheme. 6 months earlier, a similar one sold through another auction house for $275,000. And 6 months before that, the first hand-painted example to appear publicly sold for $525,000. And with a rocket-firing prototype crossing the $1 million mark in the spring of 2024, there was no telling where this one would land. However, by the end of the evening, the Rocket Fett, often viewed as not only the most desirable Star Wars action figure, but possibly the most famous toy prototype in the world, surprised everyone. It only drew 3 bids, and hammered at a shocking $85,000, with a final price of $103,700, including the 22% buyer's premium. A month later, Goldin featured another Rocket Fett in its August auction. This time it was the version closest to the production phase, and the one children were supposed to receive in 1979. Did it fare any better than the June sale? And was that June sale an anomaly, or is the Rocket Fett market experiencing a value reset? This is a look at the history of public sales of the Rocket-Firing Boba Fett over the previous decade. This is the story of the legendary prototype, how it came to be, why it was never released, and how it became the most iconic toy prototype in the world. This is an update on the shocking, and maybe not so surprising, current state of the rocket-firing market. And this is Star Wars, Prototypes and Production.
From Coruscant to Tatooine, and every planet in between, Star Wars, Prototypes and Production, with your host, David Quinn.
Vader. It's a trap!
Yes, master.
Have to stand and fight.
The more you tighten your grip, darling, the more star systems will slip through your fingers.
I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father.
The Force will be with you, always.
The design team at Kenner struggled to create the first Boba Fett action figure. Although the character did not appear in the first Star Wars film, creator George Lucas planned to introduce him in the 1978 holiday special, followed by a pivotal role in the franchise's sequel, The Empire Strikes Back. Boba Fett began as a concept of a super stormtrooper by Lucasfilm artist Ralph McQuarrie in January 1978, as Lucas began work on his next film. And with Joe Johnston's help, the character transformed into the bounty hunter who would capture Han Solo to deliver him to Jabba the Hutt in the middle chapter of the trilogy. The figure appeared at the end of the first film's promotional campaign to help draw interest in the upcoming sequel. Kenner planned to release the figure with a missile-firing capability from his jetpack, the first of its kind for the Star Wars line. And without a final version ready for promotion in January of 1979, the company used a kit-bashed concept model in its earliest television advertisements. But the beginning of the year also brought some safety concerns to the Kenner team. The first version of the rocket-firing mechanism on the back of the Boba Fett figure included a cavity for the red rocket with a spring at its base. This iteration has become known as an L-slot example, as the cavity structure resembled a backward L shape. The release lever would rest in the left horizontal nook of the L slot, keeping the spring coiled until it was moved into the vertical chamber, which would launch the four-sided rocket. But the L shape was not secure enough to hold the rocket into place, and ran the risk of accidentally firing, potentially causing injury to a child. So the team modified the firing chamber from a backwards L to a J shape, with the hopes that the lower hook of the J would contain the rocket until it was ready to be launched. The first version of the J slot had a smaller stem on the curve of the J, and the designers created a second version with a longer stem to better contain the rocket spring-loaded in its holding position. However, in solving one problem, the Kenner team was faced with another. The stem proved to be a hazard in that it broke off in a number of examples when tested, becoming a potential projectile unto itself, one that could cause injuries to the eye, or, if accidentally swallowed, to the interior of the throat. At the same time, reports surfaced around the country that the projectiles from Mattel's Battlestar Galactica figure line had become a safety issue. In addition to a number of children accidentally swallowing them or inhaling them into their lungs, one 4-year-old boy died after a Cylon Raider missile became lodged in his windpipe. Mattel quickly issued a missile recall and redesigned the toys to eliminate the firing capabilities. As safety experts called for the removal of similar small projectiles from all toys, Kenner decided to fill in the cavity from Boba Fett's jetpack and to release a non-firing version instead. It's difficult to say how many rocket-firing Boba Fett prototypes have survived, almost 50 years after they were created and tested and ultimately rejected. Of the approximately 100 that are currently known within the collecting community, it appears that 2/3 of them are the L-slot variant, with 30 or less being J-slots. There are early examples, hand-painted versions in different colored paint schemes, unpainted samples, and ones that made it to the production phase before they were swapped out for the non-firing ones, which were offered as mail-away exclusives, later appearing at retail on blister cards. So if most collectors had the non-firing version as children, why are the unproduced rocket-firing prototypes so coveted? In a way, it is the ultimate grail for Star Wars fans from that era. It is a prototype of one of the most iconic characters from George Lucas's universe. It is a relic of Star Wars history, of Boba Fett's storied history, of Kenner's history, and of the larger history of American toys. And for those who waited patiently for the bounty hunter to arrive in their mailboxes in 1979, owning a rocket-firing Boba Fett may deliver a proper sense of closure to their collecting story. The chance to bring home the version of the figure that Kenner originally promised, the one with the extra feature presented in commercials and in promotional materials, is made possible with the purchase of their surviving prototype. Star Wars fans have been hunting for the rocket-firing Boba Fett for decades. Many collectors were first alerted to the prototype's existence after seeing it in Steve Sansweet's groundbreaking book, 1992's Star Wars: From Concept to Screen to Collectible. In the 1990s and early 2000s, when collectors began to source more of them from former Kenner employees, the price range was in the $1,000 to $5,000 range, depending on the year. And with the arrival of a new sequel trilogy beginning in 2015, the value of a Rocket Fett slowly rose toward $20,000. In 2016, the UK auction house Vectis Auctions sold an ungraded example for almost $24,000. The figure was an unpainted L-slot variant. It came with a rocket and a letter of authentication from the notable toy dealer Brian's Toys. Leading up to that sale, there were very few examples of a Rocket Fett trading hands publicly. Most were sold privately or were traded by collectors. However, a sale in the spring of 2018 helped to introduce the rocket-firing Boba Fett prototype to a larger, more generalized collecting base. From 2017 to 2019, longtime collector Russell Branton sold his entire collection of rare and high-grade Star Wars Kenner items through the Hakes auction house. The first of Branton's auctions, taking place in November of 2017, made headlines for the shocking prices many of the action figures commanded. A carded Luke Skywalker sold for $50,000. And a double-telescoping carded Obi-Wan Kenobi captured the spotlight with a $76,000 sale. Brandon's items stood out, not just for the hammer prices, but for the condition and the quality. Each was graded by the Action Figure Authority, or AFA, with most earning an 85 or the highly desirable 90 out of 100. Cased in acrylic, they resembled museum pieces more than toys. And with the nostalgia for Star Wars at a fever pitch, interest in acquiring the best and rarest examples skyrocketed. For the first time, Star Wars figures were approaching the values of their top-tier Americana peers, like baseball cards and comic books, elevating to unimaginable levels over the decades. The November 2017 auction made even the most casual fan take notice. But it also generated buzz for the next Hakes sale, the 2018 spring catalog. And it featured the centerpiece from Branton's collection, an AFA 85 unpainted L-slot rocket-firing Boba Fett. Hakes originally estimated the prototype would sell in the $35,000 to $50,000 range. But by the time the Star Wars portion of the March 15th auction ended, 26 bidders propelled the price to over $86,000, including the 18% buyer's premium. From that point forward, a larger pool of collectors aggressively pursued the storied prototype, and investors saw the Rocket Fett as a fun but rewarding way to diversify their portfolios. In 2019, Hakes sold 2 more rocket-firing Boba Fetts. The first, another AFA 85L slot, sold in July for $113,000. And for its November auction, the company offered a factory-painted J-slot variant, the first one to appear publicly in a major auction. Unlike many of the other examples, it had avoided damage that came with the testing of the figure, and it earned an 85 plus by AFA. Although it underperformed its estimate of $200,000 to $350,000 and was sold at a time when interest in Star Wars collectibles had dipped, it still pulled in a healthy price of $185,850. 2020 also had 2 sales at auction, and the prices were lower than the previous year, but with good reason. First, Prop Store sold an unpainted L-slot graded at an 85 in March, right as the pandemic had flipped the world on its axis. Between the timing and the fact that action figures tended to perform better at Hakes than at any other auction house, the L-slot sold for $87,500. The collectibles market would pick up shortly after that, as interest in collecting would soar over the next 2 years. In September, Hakes sold an L-slot graded slightly lower for $62,000. But I think this was largely due to the fact that the 80-plus prototype lacked a firing mechanism. And while the grade seemed to be less important, most collectors paying that kind of money for a rocket-firing Boba Fett wanted to have the rocket-firing feature, regardless of whether it's sealed in acrylic. 2021 had one public sale at auction, but it was a massive one. For the first time, an unpainted AFA 85 L-slot crossed the $150,000 mark, selling at $165,000 with the buyer's premium. That jetpack-driven trajectory continued in 2022, with 3 notable sales of the Rocket Fett at Hakes. In March, another factory-painted J-slot came up for auction. It was the second and final version produced and contained the longer tab to secure the rocket in the firing position. However, that tab had broken off during testing, and combined with a considerable amount of paint wear to the chest, the figure received a grade of a 50. The lower grade usually would lower interest and value substantially. But this was the peak of the COVID-era collectibles market. And so this version 2 J-slot, graded at a 50, brought in a record price of $204,000. That record was broken a few months later by an unpainted L-slot graded at an 80+. It wasn't so much the item, but the nonstop propulsion of the market that assumed that Star Wars collectibles were destined to remain in the stratosphere. And this L-slot hammered in June of 2022 at $236,000. The euphoric prices wouldn't last long, though. A month later, an AFA 85 L-slot shocked the collecting community, selling for $136,000 at Hakes, exactly $100,000 less than the auction house's June Fett. In addition to becoming the face of Star Wars collecting, the Rocket Fett also served as the bellwether to the current state of the market. And July's underperformance indicated to many that the ride of the past 2 years was about to end. Maybe too many came up at once. Maybe the pace of collecting and the state of the economy finally caught up with collectors. Or maybe the hobby needed a breather. It would be exactly a year before another Rocket-Firing Boba Fett appeared at auction. In July of 2023, Hakes offered an L-slot, but with 2 aspects working against the sale. It was graded as 75+, a lesser grade than what had been offered previously for an unpainted L-slot. And while it had the spring-loaded rocket-firing mechanism, this particular figure did not come with a rocket, which to me is like getting a Reese's peanut butter cup without the peanut butter. Or I guess more accurately, but at a far lesser value, buying a pop-up lightsaber R2-D2 figure and not getting the lightsaber. It's the accessory that defines the figure. Still, the L-slot sold in July for just under $100,000, marking it as a decent sale in a downward trending market. That downward trend continued for collectibles through the rest of 2023. But for collectors, 2024 would reverse course, becoming the year of the rocket-firing Boba Fett. So what made 2024 so memorable? Of the first 4 prototypes sold publicly that year, 3 were very notable, and very different examples than what had surfaced at auction over the previous 8 years. In May, Heritage Auctions offered the first hand-painted L-slot Boba Fett. It was one of 5 hand-painted examples known to exist, and was one of 2 painted in what would become the recognizable colors of the non-firing production figure. It was molded in blue plastic, and was painted gray, with green chest armor, a brown belt, and red and orange wrist gauntlets. Due to its delicate nature, parts of the applied paint had chipped away, resulting in the figure receiving a 60 grade. But again, the grade wasn't important. This was a rare example of an already rare and heavily desirable prototype. And by the end of the auction, the hammer price was more than double the previous public record breaker. The hand-painted Rocket Fett pulled in $525,000 with the buyer's premium. For longtime fans, seeing a Boba Fett action figure cross the $500,000 mark was almost unfathomable. For those curious about the cost of a rocket for the prototype, one sold without the figure in July. Hake sold a 4-sided rocket for almost $13,000. The accessory had been authenticated and cased by AFA, but was not graded. That summer, Goldin Auctions entered the rocket-firing competition with a massive offering. It was the first complete mailer version of the prototype, as close to the final version that children would have received in their mailboxes in 1979. This example received an 85+, and was the highest of 3 that had been graded by AFA. It featured a beautiful factory-painted J-slot figure, the bag in which it came, the mailer box with the Maple Plain sender address, and 2 8-sided rockets. Also included were 2 business cards from former Kenner employee Stephen Gemperline, who was able to authenticate the mailer. If owning a rocket-firing Boba Fett prototype was a childhood wish finally fulfilled, this was the ultimate example. The box, the rockets, the figure, all were included, exactly as it would have appeared if safety concerns hadn't changed the course of history for Kenner. Over the course of the auction, 25 bids pushed the price higher and higher. In the final hour, the Rocket Fett mailer jumped in $50,000 increments, from $450,000 to $500,000 and beyond. By 11 p.m. on the East Coast that evening, the figure became the first Star Wars toy to reach $1 million, ending at $1,342,000 with the 22% buyer's premium. Over the past decade, the value of Star Wars collectibles have waxed and waned. Through the Disney releases, across the pandemic era, and in the aftermath of the transition from films to series, there have been moments of palpable excitement in the community when the spotlight shone the brightest. And there were also moments where Star Wars stepped out of the spotlight, embracing a quiet steadiness among collectors for a while. But the arrival of $1 million toy reverberates loudly. It is more of an announcement of a new era than a mere headline. It's less about a sale than a level unlocked. And it's another reminder of the power of a film franchise, one that's approaching its 50th anniversary. But these prices, a $500,000 hand-painted figure and $1 million mailer, were they truly sustainable? Were they the new values? Or were they simply a pair of one-offs reached by a frenzied bidding among people who could afford to spend that kind of money on toys? The overall market seemed to dip again in the second half of the year. The U.S. economy flirted with falling into a recession, and the increased costs of living hindered some collectors from spending on items they needed for their runs. The stagnation of Star Wars storytelling may have had an impact as well. The live-action series The Acolyte was the final straw for many fans hoping that the franchise would get back on track. And the upcoming Mandalorian and Grogu theatrical release, arriving what felt like a few years too late, did little to excite the fan base. Instead, the larger spenders and investors may have been funneling funds into other areas, like back into a stock market that seemed to be rising after the November presidential election. That fall, sales of Star Wars items sagged at auction. A beautifully curated lot of high-grade production items and early pre-production materials, like cardback photo art and proof cards, largely went unnoticed at heritage auctions. And a number of key pieces undersold at Hakes in November, like an unproduced Leia Bespin 12-inch doll and some Kenner first-shot prototypes. And in that catalog auction, an unpainted AFA 85 L-slot Rocket-Firing Boba Fett continued its larger descent, hammering at $114,000. However, the year ended on a mixed note for the coveted Boba Fett prototype. Heritage sold its second hand-painted Rocket Fett for 2024 in its December auction. As you recall, the one in May broke a record at the time, selling for $525,000. The December offering was an alternate paint scheme Boba Fett, with notable color changes to the details of the jetpack and to Boba's left wrist gauntlet. The figure was one of 2 alternate paint examples to have surfaced. It had been owned by musician Rick Springfield, the artist known for the 80s hit Jessie's Girl, and the listing described it as, quote, the crown jewel of Springfield's collection, with a, quote, storied history. It sold in December for $275,000, roughly half of what the first hand-painted figure sold for in May. And while the price is certainly respectable, it served as an indicator that Rocket Fetts may have peaked in the short term, and possibly in the long term as well. And that brings us to 2025. Hakes and Heritage took a break from offering a Rocket Fett in any of its catalog and online sales in the first 2/3 of the year so far. But Goldin has been trying to capitalize on last year's record-breaking sale of the J-Slot mailer and offered 3 desirable examples in 2025, each unique in its presentation. With sales of the unpainted L-Slot stalling, the auction houses have sought out some of the rarer iterations of the Rocket Fett. In February, Goldin listed the second and final version of the factory-painted J-Slot, the one with the longer tab. It was graded a 50 due to the paint wear on the chest armor and the fact that the tab was broken. Checking the AFA serial number, we can see that it is the exact same one that sold in March of 2022 at Hakes for $204,000. This one underperformed severely the second time around. The Goldin sale for the J-Slot in February ended at $115,900, including the buyer's premium. That's a drop of almost $90,000 in 3 years. In June, Brian Rockfell, a notable owner of multiple Rocket Fetts, sold his hand-painted alternate scheme L-Slot through Goldin. A comparable piece to the alt-paint L-Slot that sold at the end of 2024, it was reasonably expected to land in the $250,000 to $300,000 range. Goldin promoted it online and on social media and produced a 20-minute video featuring a conversation with Rockfell about his piece and why it was considered a one-of-a-kind version of the Rocket Fett. The video performed poorly on YouTube, garnering slightly more than 300 views on the channel. It looked more like an office Zoom chat than a conversation around an iconic Star Wars prototype, and didn't capture the hype that the Goldin team usually applies to its social media output, or what Hakes has been able to do with its Jeff Jacob collection sales marketing. But the lack of effective promotion was only one part of the story. In April, President Donald Trump instituted changes to the country's tariffs program, causing uncertainty in the stock market. And although the market has largely recovered since then, the uneasiness and uncertainty has remained. And with the Star Wars collectibles market falling out of favor among a larger collecting audience, the willingness to spend six figures on a prototype diminished as well. On top of that, as I mentioned in the introduction, many of the sports-related pieces in that same June auction outperformed estimates. Currently, while interest in comics and toys have dipped considerably, sports cards and Pokemon cards have heated up in a major way, returning to prices seen during the pandemic era's boom. Auction houses haven't helped themselves either. Hakes and Heritage have trumpeted many of the pieces in the catalogs based on their grades, often including the phrase highest in population report in their listings, headings, and descriptions. This emphasis on grade makes sense for the more common production items, but certainly doesn't matter as much for something like a hand-painted Rocket Fett, which might be one of 5 or one of 2 in existence. As a result, some low-grade but rare items have been overlooked, as investors, collectors, and bidders wait for a higher-grade example that may never come or doesn't exist. Is that what happened with the June Rocket Fett? It's safe to say it was a confluence of factors: Star Wars and collecting fatigue, the economy and the uncertainty of the market, a poor promotion strategy, and possibly the condition of the example offered. And this example, this AFA 70 Alt Scheme L slot, sold for only $85,000 and only $103,700 with the 22% buyer's premium. It was a devastating result for a piece that had been so desirable for so long. Rockfell commented on social media that he felt it would have sold for $200,000 more if he had offered it in a private deal instead. And he announced he would be returning to private sales in the future, after claiming to have sold a J-slot to a buyer for $300,000 a few months earlier. Selling Rocket Fetts at auction had become a very risky endeavor in 2025. And while many of us questioned whether the market had experienced a short-term stumble or a longer-term trend with this June sale, we received our answer a month later. At the beginning of August, Goldin offered its third Rocket-Firing Boba Fett prototype of the year. This one was a factory-painted J-slot, but graded a 60, and was missing the tab on the jetpack that held the rocket in place. While this one received more bids than the June figure, the majority of the bidding took place under the $30,000 mark. By the end of the evening, it tapped out at a $71,000 winning bid, totaling $86,620 with the 22% buyer's premium. After examining the history of public sales of the Rocket-Firing Boba Fett at auction, it's safe to say that values of this beloved prototype have been on the decline since last year's gravity-shaking peaks. The reality is that even in a down market, a piece like a Rocket Fett is still extremely expensive, and there are few people that can spend tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on a prototype. And if the interest isn't there for one among a larger audience, if it's seen as a poor or risky investment not just to investors, but to collectors, fewer will pursue the figures, even at depressed prices. It's impossible to know whether this is a short-term trend or a long-term reality. We saw sports and Pokemon cards return to favor after a few down years, and a lot of collecting is cyclical. But Pokemon and sports stars appeal to children. They make up a part of the group hunting rare cards, ripping packs and aiming for the autos, the patch cards, the Charizards, and whatever is the latest card to catch the attention of the respective communities. Star Wars needs a spark to remain relevant. And we've witnessed two of those sparks over the past decade that led to a new era of collecting. The first was the surprise sale of Lucasfilm to Disney and the release of the sequel trilogy. That ignited a nostalgia among longtime fans and collectors, and introduced a new generation to Star Wars. And the second was the arrival of The Mandalorian and the pandemic-era collectibles boom. But both eras were content-driven, or at least content-adjacent, and each was a total surprise. Whether it was George Lucas parting with the franchise he created, or a global outbreak that caused a worldwide quarantine, they were the catalyst that stirred the Star Wars collectibles market. Disney needs to establish a new path for Star Wars storytelling, one that keeps the older fans engaged and connected, and that encourages young fans to explore the Skywalker galaxy. The 2026 Mandalorian film may be that catalyst. Or it could be the nostalgia-driven 50th anniversary celebration of the 1977 movie in 2027. It could be something Lucasfilm is currently working on but hasn't shared with the fan base yet. Or it could be a non-Star Wars event like the pandemic that spurs a return to the collectibles in a major way. The story of the Rocket Fett isn't over by any means either. Nobody could have predicted one to sell for more than $1 million last year, and to consistently sell for under $100,000 this year. But the connection to Star Wars is deep, being cultivated over decades. Star Wars is tied to memories of friends and family, to going to the theater and to the theme parks, and it's become a yardstick by which we can measure the power of imagination. And when it comes to the toys and the prototypes, there's none more famous or more storied than the Rocket-Firing Boba Fett.